Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about the economics, dynamics, and dimensions of commercial work environments. Does your company's commercial real estate arrangement limit your business, or let it flex for new opportunities and challenges? Does it constrain, determine, or enable business growth? Office places and spaces are still integral aspects of most business ecosystems and budgets, committing and tying up millions of dollars over decades. What new possibilities can be unleashed if involved parties, including banks, brokers, and businesses, consider new service-minded approaches to the capacities, uses, and constraints of our commercial workspaces? How can landlords rethink and leases reflect the updated timeframes and realities of modern business and work habits? And contemplating the increasing potential of multidimensional online spaces and interfaces, where there are different constraints and no commutes, what future opportunities are opening up for your customers and co-workers to encounter, interact, learn, and grow within virtual dimensions? I'm delighted to be talking to Dave Cairns, Senior Vice President, Office Leasing for CBRE. Dave's an avid futurist relating to the office market. He focuses on working with high-growth companies in the tech sector, both space occupiers and asset owners. He covers office leasing, renewals, lease restructuring, subleasing, workplace strategy, and more. Dave has much experience and enlightening views about office real estate trends and future possibilities, including the importance of delivering space as a service going forward. Hi, Dave. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing today?
I am doing very well, thank you. How are things where you are in your basement? I think that's where you told me you were.
Yes, we were talking. Pre-recording about the fact that I'm in my basement. So I don't always dwell here, and while I do wear comfortable clothing, whether I'm in or out of my home, I'm not in pajamas. So my need for autonomy and my desire to connect—they're good. I'm good. No, I'm in my happy place. I'm living in Prince Edward Island,
nice.
My family and I are coming up on closer to being here for 2 years than one, which is great. And yeah, it's just incredible to me to kind of think of where we are as a family right now as compared to where we were in October of 2021. And it's really great. We're a little bit chaotic. I'm kind of living in a 3-ring circus right now with, I'm taking care of 2 dogs and my daughter while my wife is off at a cottage that we're turning into a really fantastic wellness retreat, which we'll be launching in 2024. But yeah, certainly first world problems, but we're divided as a family right now and a little chaotic. But other than that, we are doing really well.
Wonderful. And I want to understand that more. And start at the beginning of how you got here.
Mm-hmm.
You came out of college having studied political science. Actually, not even professional poker playing right then. You were then training others.
Yeah, I'll unpack that for you because I think, it's definitely pertinent to start at the beginning. And I ended up connecting 2 versions of myself at the point that the pandemic struck that I could have never predicted. And it's certainly had a huge impact on the way I view the world. I went to McGill University. I was a bit of a misfit child. Whether I have ADHD or not, I'm not sure, but I have a very difficult time focusing on things that don't really pull my attention, which school was not one of those things for me. So I certainly wanted to major in something broad. I didn't go into business. I didn't go into science. I just people told me to get a degree. I was fortunate enough to be able to be in a position to even get one in the first place. So none of that's lost on me. But I wanted to be very broad with my schooling because I just didn't really care about it, if I'm being very honest.
Okay.
So I spent more of my university career actually honing my skills as a poker player than I did
Now I understand.
going to school. Funny enough, I guess flexible working really helped me do that, right? If I had to be at the quote office on campus every day, I don't think I could have played as much poker as I did and get through school, but I managed to do both, just like a lot of employees can manage to do a lot of things too for their companies and their families and their personal lives, right?
So then you took your side hustle, your college side hustle, and that became serious.
Yeah. To cut to the chase, I left college having made about 250 grand. One really notable tournament I won. I won a tournament with almost 9,000 players in it online for $270,000 Canadian at the time, which is an interesting time to win the money too, because it was right in 08, 09 when the sort of like crisis was going on. But luckily for me, as a Canadian putting poker dollars into the system in the US dollar exchange, it's never fun. But when you draw the dollars out, it's very fun. So I got the chance to draw a lot of dollars out at a time right before everything kind of went to and that kind of just put me in a position where I didn't really need to go and get a conventional job.
Okay.
Which was really helpful and helpful to my mental state, actually, because I think that while I didn't really consciously know it at the time, the thought of having a real job, like going to work at a CBRE like I work at right now, it felt like a death sentence. Like I couldn't even conceive of doing it. So the fact that I had enough money and a reputation behind me to play poker was like lifeblood. To answer your question on the education piece, that one's actually kind of funny. I've never told this particular aspect of the story on a podcast. But I was actually a student at a training site called cardrunners.com. And I reached out on Facebook to the owner of that. And I said, hey, I just won this tournament, but I think I got pretty lucky to win it. And I'd love it if a player that's better than me could actually break down my hand histories and tell me how to be better, because I don't know that I made all the perfect decisions to win this event, right? And he sort of said, he was kind of like not really too engaged with me or whatever. I kept following up with him, wanting this outcome, which had nothing to do with training myself.
Right. Yeah.
And then finally one day, he's just like, I think getting a little bit tired of me. He's like, look, why don't you just put the videos together? And I'm like, oh, okay. So I kind of accidentally became a poker instructor.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of, that's the beginning stages of it.
I'm just curious about when you went back and you went over your hands, how close to
perfect did I play?
Yeah.
It's been a long time. I would actually love to go back and listen to my own voice, because I'll never forget, right? Like I bought a headset and a microphone, and like I sat in my room and I used this like replayer software, and you just like click through the hands and you explain what you're thinking. So honestly, Sophie, I don't even remember. It's been such a long time, but undoubtedly I would have made some big mistakes. Much like, I guess, on social media, I tend to swing big sometimes, and sometimes I hit and sometimes I crash and burn. But the cool thing about poker is sometimes you can crash and burn and make a terrible decision, but you can get lucky. So I'm sure that happened a few times. There's just no way it wouldn't have happened.
What I've understood from talking to a previously professional poker player as well is that generally when you're sitting there with 6 screens and you're playing 12 hands or something like that at the same time and you're looking for patterns, right? Which is very different from playing in person. But you've had some good wins in person as well as online, correct?
Well, I've actually had a lot more success playing online, which has always really irked me, because I actually feel I'm very good in person, and I'm able to sort of like pick up on the nuance of the human experience. So I love playing live, but the problem with live poker is that the risk reward ratios are all out of whack. So you have to spend way more money because the events have way higher buy-ins, and the amount of volume that you can play is inversely correlated. It's way down. So like if you played the live poker stops throughout the entire calendar year, if you traveled the whole world doing it, you'd probably play something like 100 tournaments in a year, versus you could easily play 100 tournaments in a week online at a lower buy-in threshold, right? And so the risk tolerance is just so inversely correlated. And
Got
unfortunately, I
it.
never cracked through in the live arena.
I'm also curious, as part of that, when you were sitting there playing for, as it says in your LinkedIn profile, between 8 and 15 hours a day, that feels like you're in the office.
Yeah, well, it does. So I'll answer that question, and I'll go back to your original question too. I think the important thing, and this is really relevant to the current landscape of work, is that it comes down to the motivation of the employee
Hmm.
as to, like, let's just say where they work and how
Right.
they work and et cetera, right? So when I was playing poker as a young person, early 20s, a lot of pep in my step or whatever. I was motivated to sit
Right.
there and play 8 to 15 hours a day in front of a computer. Did it have
Right.
a mental toll? Yes, absolutely, it
Hmm.
did. Is it something that I could have sustained doing for another decade or so? I don't even really want to know. Like, there were elements of it that were unhealthy, but the thing that was useful was that I was in control, right? If
Right.
I wanted
Right.
to take a week or 2 weeks off from playing poker altogether,
Sure.
I could do that. And it's that interesting difference between that of like a frontline worker and what I was dealing with, because
Hmm.
I couldn't make money unless I sat at the tables. Just like if you
Sure.
drive a truck, you got to drive the truck.
Right.
But I had the autonomy of deciding how many hours I was putting into that activity that required my proximity to the computer screen.
And what do you feel that you learned in terms of reading people, which is what fascinates me about the poker playing element, the empathy, the understanding people's facial expressions, which of course they are trying to hide. They're trying not to have any. I just saw a couple of photos of you playing poker. I got this very,
Stoic or whatever face.
very stoic, very clean, bland face.
Yeah.
What were the things that you've learned jumping forward in terms of being able to work effectively remotely?
Well, before I answer the question directly, you're making me think of like an interesting anecdote about live poker. So, like, when you're playing live poker, you're ultimately playing against usually one other opponent, or sometimes it's multiple opponents. But
Hmm.
you have to think of like how you approach your strategy with each individual player. So, like, if I'm
Hmm.
playing against someone that's really really good, I'm going to go stoic and I'm going to say nothing,
Okay.
right? But if I'm playing against somebody that I know I can get an edge from speaking to, I'm fine to do that, knowing that the smart player is probably going to pick up a tell on me in
Right.
relation to how I'm talking and interacting with that player. But I
Right.
don't care about that, because when I go back and play with that other smarter player, I'm just going to button
Okay.
down and say
Right.
nothing and do nothing, right? So it's actually very dynamic in that respect, playing live. That's what we call in-person play. And so, look, I mean, like, a lot of people make arguments for the importance of being together for certain activities and how you can benefit from it and all that. And I've never denied that. Although I think a lot of times some people that have traditional views think I'm denying that, because I tend to focus on some of the other stuff. The thing that would always happen to me when I would talk to people in my life who had no experience with poker is they would always say to me, how can you read people online? And it's a normal question to ask. Like, if I didn't have an understanding of poker, I'd probably ask the same thing. But the most important aspect of playing poker is following pattern recognition. So when you're playing with a player, whether it's online or in person, at the beginning, you're going to have to do what's called thin slice them. You're
Mhm.
going to have to observe really, really incomplete data and make a characterization of them that's as complete as it can possibly be.
Okay.
Because sometimes you might get into, especially in tournament poker, where you get landed at someone else's table, the blinds are going up, you have no choice but to make actions on your hand, like, because if you don't, you might lose so many of your chips that you'll just be blinded out of the tournament.
Okay.
You must make decisions that sometimes are based on a thin slice. So that's a skill in and of itself. But ideally, over time, you start to pick up on the data set, and it's usually the betting that tells the story
Mm.
more so than it is the physicality of the person. And on the physicality piece, there are times when you can get like a super laser point read on somebody where you just know that something about their body language means something.
Right.
But you better be damn sure, is what I usually tell people, because like, if you're wrong and you're making an assessment purely based on that aspect of the variables that are in front of you, that could be really, really risky as well. So I normally actually default to the pattern stuff,
Hmm.
whether I'm in person or not. And so actually that's why there's actually less of a difference between live and online poker than I think a lot of people think.
I like this term thin slicing, thinking about when you're starting an online meeting or any kind of meeting, in fact, in person too, with some that you don't know and the type of elements that you are trying to read fast and the ones that you can prioritize to extrapolate from that thin slice that you have. You were very successful in the 3+ years that you were on the road and online. Why did you stop?
Yeah. Well, there was a bit of an inflection point moment, not too dissimilar to COVID, actually,
Mm.
that happened in the poker world in 2011. The Department of Justice in the United States indicted the two largest online poker websites for tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud, a whole
Ooh,
host
okay.
of charges, and consequently made it illegal for the entire US player pool to play online. So materially changed the games for the worse in the sense that there were less players and that the players that remained actually had a higher skill level. The US market was the largest market for
Mhm.
poker in the world, and so it had actually the largest amount of bad players. Um,
Okay.
so that kind of coincided with me taking pause because I said to myself, when I started playing poker, I never had the intent of playing long term.
Okay.
It always felt sort of like a stopgap thing for me. I couldn't think of other areas of my life making sense when I'm 40 or 50 with that kind of lifestyle. So I went into it with that. But I don't think I had the intention of leaving the game as soon as I did. It was that moment that
Got it.
caused me to, change directions.
You go into real estate. Why did you choose that particular role? Why real estate? Why was that the direction that you stayed in for a long time now there?
Yeah, well, I was a completely lost soul at 25 years old. That's the honest truth.
Okay.
I had friends and family that were in real estate. I guess I assumed I needed to get some sort of professional job, the thing that I had feared the most, Sophie, because I sort of said, well, what am I going to do? Like, I don't feel like I've got a direction to go be an entrepreneur, that nothing's coming to me. So
Okay.
that's off the table. Um, and while I've admiration and respect to no end for people that do a lot of different frontline working jobs, I have many friends now actually in my new life that are frontline workers.
Hmm.
I can't cut it in those environments. I just can't. And so
Okay.
that led me to some sort of professional job. And I was actually interviewing in insurance brokerages as well as real estate brokerages. And it was really funny to juxtapose the difference because like the insurance people were like, whoa, hold on. We're actually about mitigating risk here. Um,
And you were like, well, I was all about mitigating risk and about probability.
yeah. But the perception didn't work well there. Whereas in the sort of like wild west of commercial real estate brokerage, they certainly liked it. I think also like I tick the boxes, right? Like I was accustomed to not making money. I used to lose money more days than I would win. So when they like the common question to a young person is like, oh, are you willing to ride it out? Like, are you comfortable making
Mm.
no money for like 3 or 4 years because like the sales cycle is so long, blah blah blah.
Oh, okay.
I'm like, making no money is better than losing money. Like I am used to waking up and losing money. So if I go home neutral, I will be fine.
Oh, that is a very funny way to put it. Okay.
Yeah. So it really was just a leap of faith. Like I felt that I could bring my interpersonal skills, my analytical skills to the table, and I was young enough to be insecure enough to feel like I needed to follow the path that I was told was the right path to follow.
Mm,
Like I thought, okay, I have to grind it out here.
right.
Hopefully I'll get to the other side where I can have some more flexibility about doing things my own way, which eventually I did. And that was the appeal to me, being in a 100% commission environment. I knew that once I got past the sales training,
Mm,
I could be in the driver's seat of my success or failure and how I did it. Now, I definitely was in and out of the office a lot,
hmm
either on building tours and stuff with clients, but a lot of the time, honestly, it just wasn't a suitable environment for me to be in.
hmm
I didn't like being in an open plan space,
Right.
and I constantly would be moving around, and I think other people didn't really like that, and I didn't want to cause them any disruption. So a lot of the time I'd be just taking my job on the streets. Like my phone was my job, talking to people was my job. And so I would just do it from anywhere. But to kind of fast forward, like when the pandemic happened and we all got thrust into remote working, I was watching my industry behave very typical of what I thought they would be behaving like, but it felt like the definition of insanity to me. Like, we were kind of like thinking like this will pass. It's going to be a couple weeks, which of course everybody thought on some basis, but like I'd see these reports coming out from Asia being like, we're tracking Asia and we're returning to the office there. So, fear not, we'll be back soon. And like, my brain was like, okay, that's not happening. First of all,
Right.
it's not going to happen. And by it not happening, with every day that we are out of this environment, we are going to be structurally different than we were before. And so I took it as an opportunity to lean into exploring my own mind really through content creation. I spent most of the first year or two in the pandemic kind of talking about the structural inefficiencies between supply and demand in commercial real estate.
Mm-hmm.
But as you know, Sophie, like more recently, I've kind of like bled more into, I don't even know, corporate culture, HR. I don't even, maybe you might even call myself like I'm like a social justice person in certain respects.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding myself less and less interested in corporate real estate, not necessarily because I don't see ways to monetize it in interesting ways, but because I think it's like that is a byproduct of understanding a whole host of other things.
Sure.
So I spend more time thinking about that stuff now than I do about where the markets are at.
Agreed. And I would like to think about that for a second.
Oh yeah, we can go into it. We can definitely go into it.
So, in terms of resistance to change, and when there is so much tied up in real estate, I mentioned to you an interesting Atlantic article called "The Next Crisis Will Start with Empty Buildings," which talks about the real estate loans, how many regional banks in the US are holding commercial property loans, and that whole ecosystem is therefore obviously generating some challenging questions about where we should go. In fact, that article is not trying to push everybody back into the office, but really talking about how we can rethink things. So with that, as you're already during the pandemic and early on in the pandemic, looking through the lens of, so what does that mean if I'm looking way beyond the returning to the office and everything's going to be exactly the same? What have you been projecting? Because there are so many different things tied up, which are pretty significant.
Yeah, well, let's do what you did at the beginning, and let's start at the beginning. If we look at pre-pandemic sort of trends around the real estate market, there were a few things that were going on. One, WeWork was a company that came onto the scene in like 2011, but by 2015, 16, 17, they were a notable company that were seen as a threat, really, in the commercial real estate sector.
Okay.
I think that landlords, felt that this was while Regus and IWG Group had been around for like 30 years, they were more seen as a business center, and nobody really saw them as a threat, even though they had way more holdings than WeWork ever did. Like, I think WeWork maybe got up to like 800 or so locations at their peak. I mean, someone could please correct me if I'm wrong in listening to this, but let's just say that's the case for argument. Whereas IWG, which is the parent of Regus, they probably had like 3,000 or 3,500 locations at the same time.
Got it.
So they were significantly larger. But what WeWork did that needed to be done is they created a consumer-facing brand in the real estate industry. For the first time in the history of office real estate, you could sit at a dinner table with someone who didn't know anything about real estate, and they would know WeWork, just like they knew Nike and Coca-Cola and things like that.
Right.
And so that was representative of the shift, which is real estate is really now more of a B2B to C play. I think eventually it'll be like mostly B2C, but that's sort of down the road.
Right.
But they exposed the fact that office buildings have more risk in them than we all thought that they did, because the tenant, which is the customer in the conventional sense, is seeking far more lease flexibility and service than they ever got. And the employee wants hospitality, great technology, a network of spaces that they can hopefully even use on a global scale. Like these are the things that they need. And so what's happening now in the real estate industry is that that's been exposed. The veil's been lifted, but we have a fundamental problem, which is that the valuation methodology in the industry and the way that the capital markets actually value commercial real estate is tied up in long-term leases and also tied up in the financial covenants of say a bank is your perfect tenant, like a big bank, like a
Okay.
JP Morgan or a CIBC or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, right? The whole valuation methodology is set up on that basis. But underneath all of it is a completely changed sentiment of the actual customer, which
Got
are
it.
the human beings that walk into the building. But it's taking time to reveal itself.
Right.
And COVID has massively accelerated things. Like, to give you some context, in downtown Toronto, which was the lowest office vacancy market in the world, basically,
Okay.
we had sub 2% vacancy in 2019.
Oh, wow.
We're now at like 16% vacancy or something like that. But what I find particularly interesting is looking at the tech submarkets. So
Mm-hmm.
in every major city, there will be these nodes that technology companies predominantly prefer to be in.
Right.
And one of them in Toronto is called the entertainment district.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an area that's kind of a live, work, play environment. Where a lot of young people live. There's probably something like 700,000 people that live within a 4-kilometer radius of downtown Toronto's financial district. And a lot of them are literally a 15, 20-minute walk away from that downtown market, living in an area that has now got a lot of office inventory that got delivered sort of in the 90s and the 2000s. And increasingly, development actually started to happen above these textile factory buildings that got converted into offices in the 2010s.
Okay.
Because there was just so much demand for office space.
Right.
But now these office environments in these tech hubs are ghost towns because all of the tech companies have embraced remote work for whatever their reasons are. Either they're totally set up to work distributed, or we should probably say they're doing it from a talent and retention perspective. They can't afford to call people back to the office or they're going to lose people, right?
Right.
So you've got the restaurants that are bustling in this area, you've got condos that people are living in, and you've got office that nobody's using. And so that is just a really interesting thing for me to see, because if the pandemic didn't happen, would that submarket of downtown Toronto, which is probably sitting at around 20% vacant when you consider sublease availability, which is companies that are trying to get rid of an office obligation that they're currently paying for, or directly vacant space that a landlord is holding themselves that they're trying to lease, when you combine those two together, they're probably roughly 20%. And again, none of that even considers the future vacancy that is likely to hit the landlord's books, as a lot of this space comes back to them either through tenants fully like walking away from leases or downsizing the amount of space that they need, which is probably going to be the more average outcome. I don't think that most companies are going to ditch their offices, but a lot of them are going to ask themselves, why do I need this much space?
And in that particular area, it sounds like those offices that are so vacant now could actually be repurposed for residential relatively easily, perhaps. And there are a whole bunch of people who are living in that radius anyway, which is different from what I understand from New York or other cities where there's a real problem with trying to convert from office to residential.
Let me touch on that. But before I go, I mean, I don't want to paint an apocalyptic picture because it's obviously very nuanced.
Yes.
Is the thing. So let's say this too. There's nuance, but I actually want to call out my industry, because what we often say is that the newest quality real estate is performing very well. Like the stuff that's been built post 2010 is doing fine.
Right.
And that is true. I actually think the primary reason that it's true is that the majority of that real estate is in the downtown financial districts. These are new glass tower buildings that the largest companies in the world are renting big swaths of space.
Sure.
And those companies have taken 10, 15, 20, 25-year leases in some cases.
Oh, wow.
And so the big part of the reason why that space is sitting pretty, quote unquote, is the fact that they have high credit tenants that are paying them rent on leases that they already signed. And that is a big part of it. Now, that's not exclusively the case. There are developments in downtown Toronto, such as CIBC Square, which is a development by Ivanhoe Cambridge, that a 3 million square foot 2-tower complex that currently has probably 800,000 square feet of vacancy in the second phase that they're trying to lease. And they are the beneficiary right now of any tenant in the market that's looking for new sizable amounts of space
Right.
that are and a lot of these organizations are maybe trying to build a new strategy and are
Okay.
going to go and lease 10 or 15 or 20 years space or something like that, but they're going to be thinking about it very differently. And in a lot of
Sure.
instances, it's a downsizing effort that's going on. But some landlords and some buildings are actually still doing fine. But overall,
Right.
there's even a quality product out there that is just no longer really in vogue in the way that it was in 2019. And there's certainly a lot of B and C quality real estate that's not in good shape at all. And to go to your question around conversions, a lot of this bad quality real estate has way too large of a floor plate to build out residential. It doesn't draw enough natural light into the core of the building.
Okay.
So that's a critical
Got it.
X.
Yeah.
Then the cost associated is massive. Like when you think about even just like the plumbing and HVAC system upgrades that need to be made to a commercial building, like think about how many more washrooms you need. Think about how many more kitchen sinks you need,
Right. Okay.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep,
It is
yep.
a massive, massive problem, and it rules out a lot of the real estate.
So what do you anticipate being the solution, no matter how many people are pushing their employees back to the office, however many days a week, these offices are not going to be filling up. The beginning of 23 US office vacancy topped 20%, and San Francisco, Dallas, and Houston, it was 25%. What are the changes that are not possible, but viable and likely as all of this reshapes? Because you're coming at it not just from what is my company doing and how are we going to be moving in and out of the office. It's much more on the macro level. So I'm kind of curious as to what you're predicting or hoping for.
Yeah, well, I wish I could actually make an accurate prediction because, I mean, it's anybody's best guess. I think that in the short term, what companies could do to help themselves out is try to find ways to actually partner up with the likes of the WeWorks of the world. And I'm only using that name just because it's a notable name. I mean, obviously the company's performance is really not doing very well right now, but we're calling that sector the space as a service sector.
Right.
And so what you have happening right now is there's more demand out there for a lot of different short-term use cases for office space.
Right.
But there's really a waning demand for medium and long-term office space. So let's just say you're Rogers Communications, the largest telecom company in Canada, who's got tons of office real estate with varied lease term expiries, many of which go into the 2030s, right?
Yeah.
And like their space is not necessarily designed in a way that's going to make it useful to the average company, and there's low demand.
Right.
You could partner up with various different space as a service partners to see if you could find a way to extract some form of monetization out of that space while it's basically sitting there dormant, and hopefully also make some sort of contribution economically and socially. Do you know what I mean? Because like think of the different like nonprofit groups or small companies that could benefit from using it on an ad hoc basis that right now are locked out because that space is just sitting there with a long-term lease. It's great for the balance sheet of the landlord that owns the property, but it's actually just not good for society.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So there's but there's just going to be new territory because most leases would prevent a tenant from being able to actually enter into an agreement like that. And so you're probably going to see a lot of lease restructuring in that respect. But, honestly, Sophie, on the other end of the stick is a lot of companies that are basically sitting on their hands doing nothing about it. And that's actually equally as bad and dangerous for society and unproductive as it is for landlords to not try to find a way to activate buildings differently.
Right.
And so you'll see a lot of organizations that have the mentality that this is our turf. We own this space. We're not giving up some of it to somebody else, or we're certainly not going to let some operator come in and monetize this space. Depending on how the company's doing, real estate represents anywhere between 5 to 10% of their overall cost.
Right.
And some of them don't really care that much. And that's just like that sort of like apathy is indicative of like every other problem that we have in the world. And that's not good. But that's something that companies could do in the short term.
Yeah. And I think it is part of this mindset shift. really embracing the fact that we're not going to be going backwards and things have changed. And it's really a question of recognizing the complexity of all these interdependent dynamics and the situation and really embracing that and moving forward with it. Which leads me to where we are now, to the bigger picture, the multidimensionality of all these different elements of how people are working. You then moved or had already moved away from Toronto. You picked this particular island. And how then have you set yourself up, and how do you see that as mirroring and echoing the life and the choices that you see so many other people making or going through their epiphanies to set themselves up in very different ways?
Yeah. Well, an aspect of progress can always be said to be a returning to something that we already knew. And for me, I kind of was able to tap back into this more digitally nomadic guy, a person who knew how to build relationships with people, at least remote first.
Yep.
Like as a poker player, good luck having much of a social life or a network to collaborate and learn if you're trying to do it locally, right? Like you're just going to fail. Just like a lot of leaders talk about now, it's like why talent attraction and retention needs to be a global thing is really for the same fundamental reasons that I faced as a poker player. Like it's out of necessity. It's not like a nice to have thing. So for me, being able to kind of tap back into that part of myself, I think was kind of a unique thing for me being in the industry that I'm in. Because most people that are in my industry would have just gone right into the office, stayed in the office the whole time, and this is not intended with any disrespect. It's just a reality. Right. They would have had a one-dimensional view of everything because they literally spent all of their time inside of one physical environment, one culture, not spending much time being a global citizen, engaging with people from around the world. Right. Living and breathing in a hyper-localized business. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that it's not a competitive advantage.
Sure.
In the world that we're living in right now. And so all of that sent my wife and I on more of an exploratory journey of trying to figure out what to do with our life next. I mean, the thing that we both had in common is that we were sick of living in Toronto. Okay. What specifically we would do to solve that problem was something that fluxed. At first, I was actually looking at joining a colleague of mine in San Francisco at CBRE, someone who to this day is a great friend of mine. His name is Dan Harvey. Shout out Dan. We wanted to work together, but some immigration issues just kind of didn't allow it to pan out. But when I look in the rearview mirror, it was kind of a detour in the right direction because not that it's nothing specific about actually moving to the States, even though that has its own challenges. It was more that I don't think that I wanted to restart as an office leasing broker in a new market and commit myself to that activity for another decade, because it takes a lot of time and energy to build yourself up. So what I've kind of been doing in the now is I'm actually working with a lot of these space as a service operators, trying to help them grow their footprints across North America. So funny enough, Sophie, it's a remote job, right? I can't be in 10 cities at the same time. I've also always joked with my real estate industry colleagues that like so much of the work that we do is quote unquote remote work. You're just choosing to do it from an office, and power to you. Do it from that office if that's where you want to do it. But don't deny the fact that a lot of the work that we're doing here is like what we're doing right now. It's location independent work, right? And so, given that I'm doing that kind of work, it allowed me to unshackle myself a little bit more from needing to be in the office every day. So I do travel when I need to related to those types of assignments. But, funny again, you'll find that it's less often than you'd think that you actually need to travel. You can decide to travel.
Exactly.
But the need is so much lower than you'd think. And why I actually love working with these spaces as service operators is that the whole ethos of their organizations is actually remote first. Despite the fact that they supply real estate, the way they run their own cultures are completely location independent. So they don't care where I live. They actually think it's great. They celebrate it. And so I love that. And I'm passionate to be tied to an aspect of the industry that I think is part of reshaping some of the problems that you brought up in the previous phase of the conversation that we touched on. I didn't get a huge chance to talk about that, but like if you can bridge the gap of supply and demand and eventually, maximize the envelope of a building in such a way where you don't have any of that wasted space where companies are just not using
Right.
it at all, but they're renting it.
Mm-hmm.
That then actually makes, at least we can say, okay, this building is contributing to carbon emissions, but you know what? It's being used.
Right. Yep.
Versus today where it's not being used. So that all of that stuff led me to be able to make this decision. But when the San Francisco thing didn't come to bear, my wife looked at me and she said, Dave, like, you've basically been gaslighting me on this whole thing to move to PEI. Like, I'm sick of it. Like, you're not seeing this clearly. Like, why would we not move to our favorite place on earth?
Oh, so you already really knew the island. Okay.
Oh yeah, we've been in love with it for years, and we
Oh,
actually were trying to buy vacation property here pre-pandemic. Our goal was to like spend as many months here as we could,
okay.
and I would have like probably done something really stupid in every respect, like come out here and then like fly back to Toronto for stupid
Right.
reasons, living some like life that I'm so glad I don't have to live anymore. But she's just like, Dave, like, we have to go there. Like, this is like our calling. We got to do it. This is the time. Like, the world's changed. And I just like thank God for her in every respect, because I was literally stalling us out. Like, I was such a block. And, I had a lot of insecurity. I was just like, oh, what are my people in my industry going to think? Like, is this going to be a nail in the coffin for me? Like, should I just pretend that I'm happy and go back and go to the office and try to lease office space in Toronto for the rest of my life and blah, blah, blah. And she helpfully persuaded me not to go down that road. And it's been an incredible journey coming here. And I mean, I want to touch on the interplay between knowledge workers and frontline workers, and how much richer communities can be, and how many socioeconomic divides can actually be melting away if we
Right.
allow for
Yeah.
knowledge working people and frontline working people and people from small towns to interact with people that came from the city. Like, there's such an opportunity there, and
Yeah.
it often gets passed over by everybody that's focused on the status quo, because you got New York City that's got real estate taxes that aren't getting paid, and it's a huge
Right.
problem,
Right.
right? And you've got people that are leaving different cities, not in droves. It's not like a mass exodus or anything like that, but people like me are leaving, and we're bringing our economic value to places like Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island,
Right.
right? And not all aspects of it are positive, even in this sense, right? Like, if more people like me move out here, real estate costs arguably go
Mhm.
up, but also economies get either revived or supported better. New businesses may get started through entrepreneurs coming out here to places like where I
Right.
live, and that's also not zero sum, right? Like, you may find I've made so many island friends. Like, I'm not sitting here in isolation.
Right.
Like, I have a deeper and richer community of people than I ever had in Toronto. I'm far more interconnected into the fabric of my society than I ever was in this large city that I used to live in my whole life. And we're forging relationships with people all over that are both economic and social, and it's incredible, and more of it needs to happen.
There's so little of that is highlighted and written about in terms of some of the socioeconomic benefits that are in these other towns and environments, wherever they may be, as we see this significant shift that is in the middle of transformation. And as you said, who knows how it's actually going to play out. But in the process, there are so many new communities and connections that are being woven together. What haven't I asked you that I should have done?
I'm glad you asked. It's very easy for me to
Okay.
answer. The metaverse.
Mm.
Virtual worlds. That's probably a better way of putting it, because look, the metaverse as an interoperable, immersive internet experience has not
Hmm.
arrived. Okay. Like, we can't take our physical bodies and plant them in a virtual world and move freely between worlds like we do here. Like, I can't like get on a plane. Here I can get on a plane and fly to
Right.
London, wherever you are, and my same person shows up with the same backpack and
Right.
everything. That can't happen. There is no metaverse yet. And I think it's super important to actually, it's almost like hybrid work, and like a lot of these definitions, they have like charged
Mm.
feelings depending on what side you're coming from. But let's just call it virtual worlds for an argument's sake for now. Roughly 6 or 7 months ago, a friend of mine named Chris Moeller approached me, and he asked me, if I'd be interested in joining him in creating a conversation series, a roundtable discussion series called Inspired People, Inspired Places. And the intent behind this discussion series was to talk about 5 areas of the future: work, education, regenerative technology, that kind of technology that gives you your time back, well-being, and community. And he said, like, would you like to do that with me? And I said, yeah, that sounds interesting. Why do you like this modality for it? And we kind of debated it. And what we decided on is that we thought we might be able to earn people's attention better if we created friction. And the friction is you got to create an avatar. You have to, quote unquote, commute to a virtual space. And because it's awkward and a lot of people haven't tried it, you're going to have to expend more of your mental energy to actually be in that conversation. So can we actually get more from people in that sense was one of them. And then the other was, the other primary one was, can we look at this from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective and invite a lot of marginalized groups, not specifically invite them in, like bring in anybody who wants to come, but maybe just by virtue of doing it this way, will we see people that maybe have disabilities or are neurodivergent or just for whatever the reasons don't even feel comfortable getting on video like me and you are right now? Might they show a more authentic version of themselves, and what might that do to carry a conversation forward? So that was another reason that we decided to do it. And then what I've just found is that the people that show up to these conversations are incredibly curious, incredibly open-minded, incredibly empathetic, are all actually trying to genuinely connect with one another. And the thing that I'm loving, honestly, the most about it is we are actually embodying a lot of the things that people in the office industry are saying are mission critical to innovation, which is all these like sort of informal conversations, being able to be in a group and break away and have a semi-private conversation. Like these types of things can actually happen in a virtual world, unlike a Zoom environment where it's just like very static. It's like you're either in the call or you're out of the call. Like it's just like not like that. So we're bearing witness to some stuff that like I think I'm going to be writing white papers on soon, just based on what we're doing. And yeah, I think another thing that's really important for people to understand is like, again, talking about the media, right? It's like a lot of the perception is like you either are all in on the metaverse and you want to live in a virtual world in your basement in pajamas and be a total degenerate, or you're going to go back to the office and be a normal contributing member of society. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of the juxtaposition. And of course, it's not that at all. Like there are going to be use cases that are potentially more productive to deploy the metaverse for. There are going to be people that, frankly, benefit from being in that environment more. There's going to be potentially a need to interact in these environments more as we bear witness to deglobalization, climate change, things like that, because we can actually get some of those intangible benefits that we can get in person in that environment that may not be best served over Zoom. So like there's a million like ways in which this can be useful to us. And of course, just like every technology that ever comes into our hands, the first thing we have to do is recognize that it's addictive, that if we use it for the wrong reasons, it'll be bad for society. And we need to help rise each other up and educate each other and do it for the right reasons and do it at the right cadences, depending on the circumstances, and get it right. Like so that's how I'm seeing it. I'm super passionate about it. And we've grown this conversation series. We've been doing it every 2 weeks. We've done it 10 times now, so 20 weeks. I don't see myself stopping doing this. And it's just crazy some of the people that I've been able to get on and come and talk to us. And being able to have it also be like round table, right? So like we meet there, we have a structured conversation, and then we have all kinds of informal audience participation. And we're bringing and then we're bringing in a distributed group of people, right? It's actually really hard to get 100 people to come together in person, even if you wanted to. It's the friction from that perspective to get 50 to 100 really cool people from around the world to come together is basically nothing as compared to in person when you're talking about the metaverse. So that's the other thing you could ask me about, and that's my ramble on it.
I'm very excited and intrigued about what the possibilities are in virtual worlds. One, because there's been some really powerful evidence about how much more impactful from an empathy point of view people register the emotional impact of particular situations so much more when they're actually deeply immersed virtually. Also, because being interviewed by somebody on their podcast who had been a very serious gamer. And we were talking about the fact that in some of these games, you get to a certain level and you have to collaborate with 50 people. You form these guilds, and he had led a guild for a long time. And those people who had never met before, they never even seen their faces before, only as avatars, and they were able to collaborate, test hypotheses, and get to higher levels. And that really blew me away in terms of what that means about how much we can collaborate in those type of virtual situations.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so happy you brought all that up. I think it's so cool, Sophie, too, that you just intuitively get that stuff. Like, that's awesome. But yeah, like, like on that front, what I hate actually about how we characterize these virtual sort of worlds is that it's seen as dystopic. It's seen that people are seen to be like antisocial and weird, and like, oh yeah, sure, 50 people can collaborate on the internet, but they're weirdos.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
sort of like by the way, I want to be very clear.
Sure.
I don't think that at all, but that I'm going to call out the
For sure.
biases because
Yeah.
like those are some of the biases. And that's so damaging in two reasons. It's really damaging. One, you're judging people that you shouldn't be judging. You should be embracing their differences and actually seeing it as a way to interact with someone that you might have an inherent bias for, that you need to check, but that you can actually not even have to consider if you're just talking to them, which is a huge benefit, because even people that are liberal and open-minded, we're going to bring our inherent biases that we're going to have to check, right? But then, let's not talk about the people that don't check them, because those people are the most dangerous, but we're losing that opportunity, and we're making it seem like it's a bad thing for people that are kind of on the fence, who might consider trying it, to try it. And when we think of all the benefits that we're bringing up right now, like the use cases are there. So let's not talk about it that way, is kind of the way I see it.
So as we wrap up, what can a company or a leader today do for tomorrow that is potentially either helping them rethink their office space, or more generally be thinking about whether it's the metaverse and virtual space, or just how they're adapting for the future of work here and in the future?
Yeah, well, I think you have to start at first principles. You have to actually design how you work differently first. What I'll say is that I intuitively understand a lot of those hows, but I'm not the expert. Like people like Darren Murph, Annie Dean, like, John Roridan, like these are people that actually truly deeply understand the how. So I won't go into the hows, but you got to start with the how. And then if I started a company, tomorrow, I would not get an office to start at all. I'd be fully distributed. I would actually start collaborating in the metaverse. And look, I'm biased, so I'm going to call my bias out. I mean, and I'm not suggesting that every company should or can or wants to do it that way, but I would actually test out how we are collaborating in that kind of an environment before ever considering any physical real estate. Frankly, first and foremost, from a cost mitigation and risk mitigation perspective, because there's no downside to getting it wrong in that kind of an environment, right? Like the costs are nominal. You can, and even a big company, like even if you went and spent $500,000 to build your own campus, which probably wouldn't be the best place to start, but even if you did that, like that would be a great risk to take to observe how your employees would move forward. But the key is going to be the activation of that collaboration and the intention behind it. Because like, just take what we're doing with Inspired People, Inspired Places, right? We are starting with a conversation, which is really meaningful. So people are coming first and foremost for that. They're then seeing the benefit of like hanging out before, hanging out after. We're now thinking of like different events that we can put on, ways that we can encourage people to come and like quote unquote co-work for the day. Like we're building out use cases.
Nice.
And then the question becomes, okay, now how do we apply those principles to our in-person gatherings?
Right.
Do we need to do them quarterly? Do we need office space, et cetera, et cetera? So I would do that. I guess the only extra that I would add is I would want to make sure if I had a company that my employees had the opportunity to choose where they worked. So if home was not the right place for them, I would be partnered with one of the office. They used to be called marketplaces, but they're more like consultants now. Like whether it's Dasana, Liquid Space, Upflex, Hubly. There's a million of them out there. They're all great. I would partner up with one or more of those to make sure that my employees could always book a space when they needed one. So that's how I'd go about it.
Dave, thank you. We have covered a huge amount. We've gone long, and I love the fact that we've actually gone into the metaverse. The future of work obviously has one foot, or at least a toe for now, in the metaverse. Thank you very much.
Well, we're gonna get you into the metaverse now. You'll come and be a speaker for us.
Would love to.
Thank you for the conversation. I really appreciated it.
Thanks again so much to Dave Cairns, SVP Office Leasing at CBRE, an office market futurist. You can follow Dave on LinkedIn and on Twitter at TheDigitalHomad, TheDigitalHomad. Immediate action tip. If you are starting a new company, test out collaborating in virtual environments before considering physical real estate. From a cost and risk mitigation perspective, people come first and foremost. So the key is activating collaboration and the intention you put behind it. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Why not like it? And even write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated, useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @SophieWade. For more information to help navigate this period of transformation, you can also sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on LinkedIn and my blog, which is available on sophiewade.com and flexelnetwork.com. Until next time.